Good morning and welcome to World News, coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Michal Šimečka. In the beginning of a breaking story from Ukraine, at least 4 people were killed and 3 were injured in a Russian airstrike on Kyiv in the early hours of Saturday morning. Significant destruction has been reported across the city. Local authorities report that a water supply pipeline and an entrance to a metro station were damaged in the attack. Several cars caught fire and debris is scattered across Kyiv's Desnyansky district. Security for NATO and the EU remains crucial for Europe as Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced closer cooperation with Poland. The two nations are expected to work on a new defence and security pact.
Poland and the UK are long-standing allies with a partnership that goes back generations. Now the two NATO allies once again face a common threat, an aggressive Russia that seeks to destabilize all of Europe.
The key objective here will be fending off Russia's aggression. I think some of the key focuses will be on coordinating efforts to tackle disinformation and hybrid threats, which is something that the UK and the Polish side has been doing for quite a few years now.
With the prospect of Donald Trump potentially reducing U.S. military support for Kyiv, key NATO allies have been prompted to do more on their own. The timing of the British Prime Minister's visit to Warsaw is meant to send a signal.
The UK is anxious about its position in the world, about its relationship with key allies, and it's looking to strengthen those partnerships, and thus the visits to Ukraine, the visit today to Poland.
It was former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson who was the first Western leader to travel to embattled Ukraine after the full-scale invasion by Moscow. Keir Starmer visited Kyiv on Thursday, following the tradition of UK support for Ukraine. Once again, the PM ensured that London's backing would continue, pledging security guarantees as well as a new mobile air defence system.
We agree that it must be a peace that guarantees your security, your independence, and your right to choose your own future. We will work with you and with all of our allies on steps that would be robust enough to guarantee Ukraine's security.
These declarations come at a crucial time as Russia makes gains in Ukraine, striking energy grids and cities during a harsh winter. As a major NATO player, the UK has operational capabilities to defend the eastern flank. That goes hand in hand with Poland, which has invested heavily in its modern armed forces in the last years. Together, the two nations have developed common military projects, including the Miecznik, or Swordfish, frigate, as well as advanced air defense systems. Starmer has also shored up Britain's commitment in the High North and Baltic with the Joint Expeditionary Force, a multinational partnership which includes 10 nations, as he recently toured military sites in Estonia. Even if the return of Donald Trump may result in less U.S. engagement in NATO, the UK and Poland's partnership looks to remain strong for the foreseeable future. Sasha Farbach, TVP World.
Belarus has moved migrants from the Polish border towards Russia, says the Polish border guard. The relocation of the migrants comes ahead of the upcoming presidential election in Belarus. The regime of Alexander Lukashenko has used the migrants as a weapon aimed at the West, forcing them to storm the borders of Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. Here's more.
The Polish border with Belarus has been under constant attacks by aggressive illegal migrants, aided by Belarusian soldiers for the past 4 years. But now it's gone much quieter. The deputy of the Podlasie Border Guard unit has an explanation for the shift.
At some point we observed that migrants were being taken towards Russia from the border zone. Lukashenko may be interested in peace in the country before the presidential election.
Alexander Lukashenko has been the only president of Belarus since the office was created in the 1990s. According to international observers and domestic opposition movements, Lukashenko has won each election through a rigged vote. The upcoming election is expected to be no different.
They have nothing in common with the free and fair process of people voting for some candidates, because all those who anyhow deserve the right to participate in these elections, either in jails, either in abroad, either they are keeping silence inside the country.
Democratic opposition in Belarus is brutally persecuted by the Lukashenko regime. There are more than 1,200 political prisoners in the country, according to the Vyasna Human Rights Center. Belarus, a former Soviet republic, has been under heavy influence of Russia for decades. During the launch of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a large part of Russian troops entered the country from the south of Belarus, making Minsk a party in the war. The sham presidential election will take place on January 26th.
Michal Šimečka, the leader of the main opposition party in Slovakia, has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in Kyiv against the backdrop of the latter's rocky relationship with Slovakia's incumbent government. Šimečka's visit to Kyiv comes after Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico ignored a similar invite issued by Zelenskyy. The relationship between Slovakia and Ukraine has been rocky recently over Ukraine's refusal to renew an agreement allowing for Russian gas to pass through its territory. Zelenskyy also said that he is ready to hold an open dialogue with the Slovakian government despite its leader's refusal to meet with him in Kyiv this week.
Between our countries.
Repressions of the Kremlin know no bounds. Poland calls for the immediate release of all political prisoners in Russia. This is the reaction of Polish authorities to the sentencing of 3 lawyers who acted for the late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Earlier, the European Commission condemned the sentencing and called on the Kremlin to release the lawyers immediately.
These words came after Alexei Navalny's lawyers, who attempted to defend the late Russian dissident from the Kremlin's regime, were sentenced to 3 to 5.5 years jail time in a Russian penal colony.
What can we say? We could expect that.
Vadim Kobzev, Alexei Liptsev and Igor Sergunin were arrested and tried for participating in an extremist organization. The lawyers were accused of illegally passing messages from Navalny, who was imprisoned in a penal colony, to his colleagues and supporters.
This is nonsense. Everything that is happening, that lawyers are being persecuted for doing their direct job. This is explained by the fact that Navalny is a toxic figure for Russia, even after his death, and all the people who helped him are now held accountable, unfortunately. This has never happened in my memory, such a mass attack on lawyers. All because they were defending Putin's #1 enemy. Very sad.
Alexei Navalny's widow, Yulia Navalnaya, shared evidence on YouTube that Navalny and his lawyers were illegally surveilled during their private meetings.
By law, such videos shouldn't exist. Meetings between a defendant and his lawyers are protected by attorney-client privilege, and no one has the right to know their contents.
The fate of Navalny's other lawyers is also in peril. Olga Mikhailova and Alexander Fedulov, who escaped Russia, will be tried in absentia. Experts and Navalny's supporters hope that should another prisoner exchange be negotiated like the one that took place last summer, Putin may be interested in swapping the sentenced lawyers.
I think the idea of exchanging true criminals that were arrested in the West for political prisoners in Russia is extremely counterproductive. Because the thing is that Putin can take as many hostages as he likes. Putin enjoys such kind of propositions. Again, as much as I want my friends to be free.
4 years ago, Alexei Navalny returned to Russia but was detained by security forces at Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport. That was Navalny's final day of freedom, as he never left the penal colony before his death a year ago.
Russia's oil profits are being squeezed by the growing cost of tanker freight due to a new package of sanctions imposed by the United States. But already, some nominees for the new U.S. administration say that Washington has been too soft on the issue and threaten further action.
Ships like these, part of the so-called Shadow Fleet, have been a key means driving the export of Russian crude since Western sanctions started biting. They handle around a quarter of the total volume of oil exports. However, Moscow has successfully evaded these restrictions. Last Friday, as part of its final actions, the outgoing Biden administration delivered the hardest blow yet.
They are the strongest one that any of sanctioning institutions imposed towards Russia energy sector, including shadow tankers.
Over 100 of these vessels were added to the sanctions list, the most effective mechanism which could put a dent in Russia's export volumes, according to Katinas.
However, when you put vessel on the sanction, nobody wants to mess with them. So this mechanism is much better compared to sanctioning only specific companies.
As a result of the new restrictions, freight prices for vessels heading to China have risen by as much as $4 million, with refineries themselves wary of allowing ships into their ports for fear of penalties. Scott Bessent, Donald Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary, reiterated that he would continue to haunt Russia's oil profits with further restrictions to bring an end to the war.
If I'm confirmed, and if President Trump requests, and as part of his strategy to end the Ukraine war, that I will be 100% on board for taking sanctions up, especially on the Russian oil majors, to levels that would bring the Russian Federation to the table.
One of Bessent's ideas to achieve this would be to increase US oil output to a level where the commodity floods the market, effectively pushing Russia out of business. However, analysts remain skeptical about the effectiveness of this approach.
If you subtract the volumes of Russian oil from the market, there's very little they can be replaced with. Gulf countries' production, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, is just not enough to replace what would be taken out of Russia.
Whether the latest sanctions package proves effective will become clearer after the grace period, a window for the energy sector to finalize orders purchased before the sanctions take effect, expected to end around March. It is also considered crucial that the West should prioritize expanding sanctions on higher-margin oil-based products, which, according to the International Energy Agency, are compensating Russia for the revenue it has lost due to sanctions on oil.
And we continue on the same topic. The more stringent sanctions we have, the more difficult for the Russian situation it is, said Tomasz Wostowski, managing partner at EU strategist law firm, in a conversation with TVP World. The parting shot of the Biden administration has been the introduction of the most comprehensive sanctions package against Russia's oil and gas industries.
It gives Trump a certain benefit to have those sanctions in place already because, he's not the one imposing them. So it gives him sort of a carte blanche and he's dealing with Putin. He comes in with a clean slate. He can say, look, I didn't do it. The previous guy did it. But it certainly, pushes Putin and Russia into a difficult situation because, as you know very well, there's talk of some possible talks about ending the war. And so far, we don't know where the Russians stand. I think we have a pretty good indication of what the Trump administration would like to happen. We don't know how they're going to achieve it. But one of the big question marks is whether the Russians will actually engage in the talks and if they're interested in the talks. So the more stringent sanctions we've got in place, the more difficult the Russian situation is, the more likely Putin is going to entertain some talks. And then, with the previous administration and the incoming administration, it was quite clear that Americans are not going to send their forces. So how can they force the Russians and Putin into the talking table? Well, the main way to do that is through sanctions. So in a way, I think it's probably helpful to the incoming Trump administration that the sanctions were put in place and that they're hard to remove, because that also gives President Trump a certain excuse for not removing them. He says, look, I can't. There's no way for me to do it. And that definitely forces the Russians to the negotiating table, because once we do have a deal that's satisfactory to everybody, it's only then that Trump could actually go back to the Congress and start talking about removing them.
Firefighters continue their efforts to gain control of the wildfires raging in LA County, which have so far charred more than 150 square kilometers and destroyed more than 12,000 structures. The death toll has risen to at least 27. The strong winds, which were making the battle to contain the flames particularly difficult, weakened earlier this week, allowing the firefighters to gain some ground. The Palisades fire is now 31% contained and the Eden fire is 65% contained. Some people have been allowed to return to evacuation zones, but tens of thousands more are waiting to find out what may be left of their homes. The U.S. National Weather Service warns that dangerous fire conditions are expected to return next week, and the charred remains of buildings pose a risk of mudslides. And with this, we conclude our news roundup, but don't go away, World Talks coming up next.